I've spent years going into places most people would never willingly visit. Remote forests, abandoned trails, mountain areas where the nearest person could be hours away. Being alone never bothered me. In fact, that was usually the reason I went. I liked the silence. I liked knowing there was nobody around. But in October of 2023, I learned something I still think about every time I'm alone in the woods. Sometimes, being alone doesn't mean you're the only one there. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm a wildlife photographer. And that year, I planned a 5-day trip into a remote mountain area to photograph wildlife before winter arrived. I wasn't searching for anything unusual. I wasn't investigating anything. I just wanted somewhere quiet, where I could work without distractions. The cabin I rented was almost 12 miles from the nearest town. There was no cell service, no nearby houses, no traffic, just a small dirt road, surrounded by miles of forest. The last half-mile was so rough that I had to park my truck and walk the rest of the way with my equipment. When I finally reached the cabin, I expected something basic, and that's exactly what it was. A small wooden building, 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a wood stove, and a large window facing the trees. The owner, Robert, was waiting there with the keys. He showed me where everything was and explained how to use the stove. Nothing seemed unusual until I was about to leave him. He stopped at the door. He looked back inside the cabin. Then he looked toward the tree line, and he said, "If you hear someone outside at night, don't go looking right away." I laughed. I thought he was making a joke. I asked, "Why? Bears?" He didn't smile. "No." He paused for a second. "Sometimes people get curious when they know someone is staying out here alone." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say, but I assumed he was just trying to scare me a little. I didn't think much about it. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted. Every morning, I hiked through the forest with my camera. I photographed deer, birds, the landscape. At night, I returned to the cabin, backed up my photos, cooked dinner, and went to sleep. Nothing happened. No strange sounds, no signs of anyone nearby. I started thinking Robert's warning had just been an unnecessary comment. Then came the third night. I woke up at around 2:30 in the morning. Not because of a loud noise, not because something woke me. I just opened my eyes and immediately felt that something was wrong. The cabin was completely silent, the kind of silent where you become aware of every small sound. I looked toward the kitchen. One of the chairs was pulled away from the table. I stared at it for a few seconds. I was almost certain I had pushed it in before going to bed, but I convinced myself I was wrong. I had been hiking all day. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I moved it without thinking. I went back to sleep. But the next morning, I noticed something else. My camera batteries were sitting beside the fireplace. I always kept them on the kitchen counter. I checked my camera bag. Everything else was exactly where I left it. That was the first moment I felt genuinely uncomfortable, because moving a chair was one thing, but I knew I didn't move those batteries. Still, I found reasons to explain it. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was forgetting things. Then I saw the footprint, a single muddy boot print, right beside the back door. My first thought was simple. Someone had been inside. I immediately checked the windows. Locked. I checked the back door. Locked. The front door. Locked. Then I looked back at the footprint, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The print wasn't facing the door. It was facing deeper into the cabin. Whoever made it had already been inside. I spent the next hour searching every corner of that cabin. The bedroom, The closet, under the bed, nothing. Nobody was there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I decided to set up one of my trail cameras inside the cabin, not because I believed anything impossible was happening. I needed proof. I needed to know if someone was coming in while I slept. I placed the camera facing the hallway. Then I went to bed. I barely slept. Every sound from the cabin made me open my eyes. The wood cracking, the wind outside, the walls shifting. At some point, exhaustion finally won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I checked the footage. For almost 3 hours, nothing happened. The camera showed an empty hallway, just darkness. Then the timestamp changed. 3:12 a.m. The bedroom door slowly opened. I watched myself sit up in bed, confused, looking toward the doorway. Then I reached for my flashlight, and before I could turn it on, the camera captured something standing in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the darkness, but then I noticed something. It wasn't moving. It was standing completely still. For 11 seconds, a person-shaped figure inside my cabin. I stopped the video. I checked the footage again. Same thing. The cabin only had one entrance, the windows were locked, and nobody had walked in. I packed my things immediately. I didn't care about finishing the trip. I didn't care about the photos. I just wanted to leave. Before driving away, I called Robert. I told him about the footage. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then I asked, "Has anyone else ever stayed in that cabin?" He finally answered, "Only people who made reservations." I asked, "Then why did you warn me about people being curious?" This time, the silence lasted longer. Finally, he said, "Because something similar happened before." I asked what he meant. He told me that years earlier, a man had rented the cabin during hunting season. 3 days later, his truck was found abandoned near the road, but the man was gone. They searched the area. They never found him. I asked Robert, "Why are you still renting that place?" His answer was simple. Because nobody ever proved anything happened there. I left that day, and I never returned. A few months later, I decided to review all the footage from my trip. Most of it was normal. Wildlife, trees moving in the wind. Nothing strange. Until I reached the recording from that night. 3:12 a.m., the hallway, the figure. But this time, I noticed something I missed before. The figure wasn't looking at me. It was looking directly at the camera, like it knew exactly where I had placed it. Then, near the end of the recording, it slowly raised one hand. It wasn't waving. It wasn't threatening me. It was pointing. I looked around the room where the camera was placed, trying to figure out what it was pointing at. And then I noticed something. The camera angle showed the reflection of the bedroom window. And in that reflection, there was another dark shape standing behind the camera. I never noticed it before. I still don't know what was inside that cabin. I don't know who made that footprint. I don't know who appeared on that recording. But I do know one thing. After that trip, I checked the cabin's online guest records. My name was there, the date of my stay. But underneath my name was another entry. Same handwriting, same date. Except the checkout date was 3 days after I had already left. And beside it, there was a note. 4 words. Still waiting for you. I haven't been back to those mountains since, and I don't think I ever will. The forest cabin that wasn't abandoned. I still don't know who was watching me that night, and the part that bothers me most is that I may have never been alone inside that cabin. My name is Noah Carter. For the past 8 years, I've worked as a wildlife photographer, mostly documenting animals in remote areas where very few people go. I've always preferred places that were quiet, places without crowds, without cell service, without anyone around. In October of 2022, I planned a 5-day trip through a remote section of national forest to photograph wildlife before winter arrived. The area wasn't popular with tourists. There were no major hiking routes, no nearby campsites, just miles of thick forest, mountains, and old service roads that were rarely used anymore. On the third day of my trip, everything changed. A storm moved in much faster than expected. The temperature dropped quickly, and heavy rain started falling before sunset. I checked my GPS and realized I was still several miles away from the nearest marked campsite. I knew I wouldn't make it before dark, so I started looking for somewhere to get out of the weather. That's when I found the cabin. It was hidden between the trees, a small wooden structure with a damaged roof, broken windows, and moss growing across the outside walls. From a distance, it looked abandoned, the kind of place that had been forgotten for years. There were no vehicles nearby, no fresh footprints around the entrance, no signs that anyone had been there recently. At first, I assumed it was an old Forest Service cabin that had been closed down. I figured it was probably just left behind after the area stopped being maintained. I didn't think much of it until I opened the door. Inside, everything looked exactly how you would expect an abandoned cabin to look. An old wooden table, a rusted stove, a broken chair near the wall, dust covering most surfaces. But then I noticed something that didn't fit. A stack of firewood was sitting beside the stove. Not old pieces of wood that had been forgotten. Freshly cut logs, dry, clean, ready to burn. I remember standing there for a few seconds just staring at it, because that one detail changed everything. Someone had been here. Recently. I started looking around more carefully. There was a metal cup beside the sink, a blanket folded neatly on the bed, and a flashlight sitting on the table. I picked it up. The battery still worked. That was the moment I should have left. But the storm outside was getting worse. The rain was hitting the roof so hard I could barely hear anything else. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe a forest worker still checked the cabin. Maybe a hunter used it during certain seasons. Maybe someone had just stopped by recently. I decided I would stay one night and leave first thing in the morning. I locked the door, started a small fire, and tried not to think about it. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The storm slowly moved away. The cabin became completely silent, almost too silent. Then, around 1:30 in the morning, my radio turned on. At first, I didn't even understand what I was hearing. The radio wasn't beside me. It was inside my backpack across the room. I grabbed my flashlight and walked over. The screen was glowing. The channel was open. I picked it up. For a few seconds, there was only static. Then I heard a voice. Quiet, distorted, almost like someone was whispering from far away. And then I heard 2 words. "He's inside." The signal immediately disappeared. I stood there holding the radio, completely frozen. I tried to explain it. Maybe someone was using the same frequency. Maybe the storm caused interference. Maybe another person nearby had a radio. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Because there was one thing I couldn't explain. The person didn't sound surprised that someone was inside the cabin. They sounded like they were warning someone. I barely slept after that. Every small sound made me look toward the door, the wind moving through the trees, the cabin walls creaking, the sound of rain dripping from the roof. I kept telling myself there was a normal explanation. But then, around 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer walking near the cabin, maybe a branch falling. But then I heard it again. A slow step, right outside the door. I turned off my flashlight and sat completely still. Another step, then another. Whoever was outside wasn't moving quickly. They were walking around the cabin. I could hear the wooden floor outside creaking under their weight. I reached for my phone. No signal. I grabbed my camera instead and held it tightly, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. For almost 5 minutes, I didn't move. Then everything stopped. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. I waited. Another minute passed, then another. Finally, I forced myself to look toward the window. The glass was covered with rain, making it almost impossible to see outside. But for a brief second, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A person, standing still, watching the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the window. Nothing. Only darkness. I didn't sleep after that. When daylight finally came, I packed my things as quickly as possible. I didn't care about finishing my trip. I just wanted to leave. Before heading back, I decided to walk around the cabin one last time. That's when I noticed something behind the building. A small path through the trees. It wasn't a hiking trail. It wasn't marked on any map. It looked like someone had walked the same route hundreds of times. I followed it for about 50 yards. And that's when I found it. A small trail camera attached to a tree. The camera was pointed directly at the cabin. I immediately felt uncomfortable, because whoever placed it there wasn't watching the forest. They were watching that cabin. I checked around the camera. There were no labels, no information, nothing showing who owned it. I decided not to touch it. I went back to the cabin to collect the rest of my things. That's when I noticed something strange. My backpack had moved. Only a few inches. Most people probably wouldn't notice. But I knew exactly where I had placed it. I always keep my gear in the same position. I checked everything. My camera was still there. My supplies were still there. Nothing was missing. Then I saw something on the table. A small piece of paper. I knew immediately it wasn't mine. I picked it up. There were only 4 words written on it. Leave before sunset. That was enough. I grabbed my backpack and left. I didn't stop walking until I reached the main trail. For the rest of the hike, I kept looking behind me. I expected to see someone following, but I never saw anyone. 2 weeks later, I contacted the local forest office. I wanted answers. I asked about the cabin. The person on the phone became quiet. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. That cabin has been closed for almost 10 years. I asked about the trail camera. He said there shouldn't be one there. I gave him the location. A few days later, he called me back. They had found it, and they recovered the footage. Most of the recordings were normal. Deer walking through the trees, birds landing near the camera. Nothing unusual. Until the final recording. The last clip was from the night I stayed there. The camera showed the cabin from outside. The lights were on, and someone was standing near the window, watching. The forest officer asked me one question. Did you know anyone else was with you that night? I told him no. I was alone. Then he sent me a screenshot from the footage. The person standing outside the cabin was facing directly toward the camera, and they were wearing the same jacket I was wearing. I never found out who that person was. I never went back to that forest. But sometimes I still think about that cabin, because I still don't know what happened that night. Was someone watching me? Or was someone trying to warn me? And if they were warning me, what exactly were they afraid of?